Hello and welcome to part one of a two-part webinar series on leadership, how to lead to better outcomes. These webinars are a prereq to the Healthcare Leadership Seminar that will take place on December 6, 2018 at the Queensberry Hotel in Glens Falls, New York. I would like to introduce our speaker, Greg Owens. Greg is a master licensed social worker with over 30 years of experience in leadership training. He has worked with AHI on numerous occasions, and we are lucky to have him present with us for our Healthcare Leadership Seminar.
So good morning and welcome to our webinar on leadership, how to lead towards better outcomes. I'm Greg Owens, and I'm here as part of the programs that we offer through the Institute at the Macedonia Baptist Church in Albany, New York. And this is how we bring our services beyond the walls of the church. And so it's a pleasure to be with you this morning. Quick background on who I am: a licensed master social worker, 32 years working for the state of New York in various management and leadership positions, and then work around New York State and around the country doing consulting in various areas, including leadership development, mentoring, engagement of young Black males, and the mind sciences of implicit bias. So it's a pleasure to be with you this morning. We're going to spend some time talking a bit about this notion of leadership. And so as I've switched to the next slide, I wonder if you just take a minute and take a look at that. And we'll read it together. If we were in a room, we'd be asking one of you to read it, but certainly I'll read it. You can read it along with me. There are many people who think they want to be matadors, only to find themselves in the ring with 2,000 pounds of bull bearing down on them, and then discover that what they really wanted was to wear tight pants and to hear the crowd roar. Now, usually when we talk about this notion of being a matador and being in the ring with 2,000 pounds of bull, we certainly know that's a metaphor for the kind of work that is required when we engage in leadership work. And so leadership work is very different than other kinds of work we do within our organizations, within our businesses, even within our personal lives. The reason that you go to certain restaurants or stores and then go back again is because you got the kind of service or performance, if you will, that you wanted, or if you chose not to go back, that you got service that was not pleasant for you, or it didn't meet your standards or your needs. That really is about leadership as well as service, and it's about low and high performance. So the connection between great leadership and high-performing organizations is what we're going to spend some time looking at this morning. But we start off with this notion of how difficult the work is, and not to underestimate the fact that this is difficult work. It is challenging work. It is work that requires mindfulness and focus and other things that are leadership characteristics that you've already used, you've already had, you're already engaged in. We want to lift those up a bit more for you this morning and find a way to be more intentional about the work. Because when you're getting to the bull ring with 2,000 pounds of bull bearing down on you, that's not the time to begin to wonder what I'm going to do, whether or not you have the appropriate skills. Am I prepared to deal with this situation? That's not the time to begin to have that conversation. You've got 2,000 pounds of bull. You've got an entire organization. And for your work, you've got an emergency situation that requires you to be as high performing as you possibly can be. So the notion of this slide, the metaphor we want to kind of lift up here, is not to underestimate the need to do leadership work. It is difficult, and it can be overwhelming if you're not careful. What we want you to walk away with today some of these objectives. Now, this is the beginning of a conversation, and I certainly want to take a moment and thank the Adirondack Health Initiative and Sarah in particular for inviting me to be a part of this morning. I've had the pleasure of working with AHI for about a year and a half in areas of cultural competence and health disparities, and a couple of times we've talked about leadership, and so I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this a bit more, because the literature supports my own premise about this, is that the more leadership work you get, the better the organization, the better the agency, the better the functioning of the entity that you're engaged in. So hopefully you'll walk away with some notions about that this morning, and these particular specific objectives, like a better understanding of yourself as a leader. You've already done leadership work in lots of different areas, in lots of different capacities. We want to drop that lens on that work and allow you to kind of do a diagnostic to find out perhaps when you were in low and high performance and how to get and stay in high performance for longer periods of time. So the second bullet, if you will, is an understanding of low and high performance. There's a tremendous amount of literature and research that indicates that those organizations that engage in high performance for longer periods of time get to better outcomes. And so how will you diagnose for leadership and high performance work? How do you get an organization that is committed to high performance, where you can find high performance throughout the organization, and where you find areas of low performance that you're able to encourage high performance, require high performance, and be able to measure that so that you can get better outcomes. Leadership functions, tools, and competencies, again, some of which you've already had and used in your personal lives, in your business world. But how do you become more intentional about that? What exactly are the tools and what works according to the literature? And then some ideas about where leaders spend their time. Most of us only have a certain amount of time during the week to engage in work. Usually it's 7.5 or 8 hours for the general workforce, if you will. But for those of us who are engaged in different kinds of work, in child welfare, and the work that you do, it doesn't necessarily get confined to 7.5 hours a day or 37.5 hours within a 2-week frame. You end up working maybe 10 or 12 hours. Where do you spend your time during that work day? And are you spending time doing leadership work or other kinds of work that we'll get to in a moment or two? So those are the things that certainly I hope you'll walk away with after we have this brief conversation today. And we'll build upon that as we move down the road and talk more about leadership. So there's a traditional leadership mindset that we've used over the course of time, and it comes from a place that perhaps it was useful and perhaps it was just convenient, but it's this notion of developing individual charismatic leaders. And so you find someone who's got the skills and the competencies, maybe even the look, and say, well, let's make that person a leader, and we'll make the organization capable of following that person. There's a problem with that, and the problem is a charismatic leader is probably going to be inclined to go elsewhere at some point in time. They may, in fact, go on to another job. If it's in government, they may, in fact, have a 4-year term, and then there's an election, and they end up out of office. And so what do you do with leadership when that kind of change occurs? And so that's a traditional and maybe even outdated mindset. So the idea now is to move from this development of individual charismatic leaders into a collective leadership mindset within the organization, where everybody knows what high performance is, what everybody knows what leadership requires, and everybody is able and encouraged to do high performance leadership work. So that really is the mindset that we're talking about now, moving from this more traditional leadership mindset into one where everybody is able to contribute to the outcomes of the organization using high performance and understanding that leadership gets us to high performance. And so the idea of people at your front desk being high performing is critical in this, because if they are low performing, the leadership question becomes, well, what would make somebody come back to this particular organization or work with me in the future or buy my product if the first person that I encounter is not high performing? And so that's why it's important to permeate leadership throughout the organization, to inundate the organization, if you will, with high performance so that everybody knows what it is, what it should look like, and where they fit. And so again, some of the tenets of leadership, again, from the literature, the traditional mindset about leadership has been that you do one thing after the other, serial leadership. The more recent, current mindset about leadership, or tenet related to leadership, is that you can do things concurrently. Now, we shouldn't confuse this with multitasking, because multitasking is really a myth. We really are serial tasking, and if you're not careful, you don't finish the task before going on to the next one, because the premise of multitasking is that you can do this, many things with the same level of proficiency and efficiency at the same time. Quite honestly, that's not supported by the science. The brain can only handle one thing at a time. And so the idea of multitasking is not what we're talking about here, but that you have to get the organization to be able to do things in multiple levels, and that people can contribute where they are in the organization is concurrent leadership. The notion of the individual, the charismatic leader at the top, is an outdated one. We want to move towards this notion of a collective body where everyone is able, capable, and willing to do leadership work. The top-down controlling leader is not the one who gets the best from their organization. They tend to hoard information. They tend to control how people move about in the organization. They tend to control the outcomes. And that's not the kind of participatory or collaborative leadership that gets us to the best outcomes and that gets us to high performance. And this last piece is really important because the idea in the past has been to be a dispassionate leader, that you leave your truest self at home and that you come into the workplace without passion and compassion. The current tenet around leadership is that you not only are compassionate about the work, but you're compassionate about the people that you're there for, the people who are there to receive your help, assistance, services, etc. And you're also compassionate about one another, that you do in fact care about what's going on with your coworkers and that you care enough about them to inquire about them, to be able to communicate effectively with them, and to work collaboratively with them. It's hard to do that if you're in a dispassionate organization. So these are some of the tenets of leadership, moving from a traditional to what's called a leaderful mindset. Max Dupree has written a lot of books about leadership. He talks about the notion of leadership looking like a jazz orchestra. And any of you who have played instruments and been involved with symphony or jazz orchestras or anything like that knows that the best sound you get is when everybody's operating in an optimal capacity. Your violins are operating well, your cellos, your basses, everybody knows what they should do, has high levels of skill, and doesn't rely upon whether or not someone else is high performing. They know that they need to be high performing and can do so. So according to Max Dupree, the first responsibility of a leader is to define reality. That's different than accepting reality, and it's risky because, as you saw from the first slide, getting into that opportunity to take on that 2,000-pound bull, you've got to be able to define reality at a moment's notice. You don't know which way that bull is going to turn, how they're going to interface with you that day. You've got to redefine reality in the moment. And the last thing that leaders need to do is to say thank you. And so if you function in an organization that doesn't have a lot of folks saying thanks for the hard work you're doing, you might want to check and see whether that's a compassionate or dispassionate organization. And in between that first responsibility and the last responsibility, or defining reality and making sure you say thank you, is this notion of becoming a servant and a debtor. So when we talk about this, people have their different perspectives and opinions about this. To me, and I hope you'll give us some thought, but to me, this means that we owe it to the people who are coming in the doors for assistance, support, help, etc., to be the best that we can be, to make sure that this is a place that they want to come for assistance, that they want us to be there, that they prefer to see us coming in the room rather than leaving the room, and that we owe a debt to the organization, to the people who are coming in the organization, to be the best and to bring our very best to the work on a regular basis. So that really is this notion of Max Dupree's indicating that the leader really has to become a servant leader and a debtor, almost able to lead from the rear if they need to. And so leadership in this next slide is not just one particular thing that only one person can do. It actually is, according to the research, a body of work. And it requires different skills and competencies that we'll talk about in a bit, that everybody has to be committed to doing leadership work in order to get to the performance that we seek in the organization. And so we can ill afford to have one component of the organization, one program, one segment of the organization not being optimal in terms of high performance, not being committed to doing the leadership work that's required, and expect to get to the best outcomes in the organization. So the third bullet sounds a bit hokey, but it is certainly profound in a lot of ways, in that this is a journey. And there will never be a time when you will be able to say comfortably that you have done all the work you need to do to get and stay in high performance. And therefore, you need to ask the next question that leaders will ask, which is, what's the next best thing I need to do on behalf of the people who are coming into the organization? What's the next best thing that I need to do to get to better outcomes? What does my environmental scan tell me about what's going on in society at this moment that potentially impacts on the outcomes that I'm seeking for the people that I say I'm coming into work for every day? And so that is an ongoing prospect and an ongoing process. And so, in fact, it is a journey and not necessarily a destination that has an endpoint. The very fact that people can continue to learn and to grow means that organizations and work can continue to grow also. And as leaders, we need to make sure that we keep that in mind. So, a question that I'd ask you to consider before we take a look at the rest of this slide: what do you think is the one thing that every leader must have? The one thing that every leader has to have? It's actually followers. I remember one of my professors saying that if you think you're leading and turn around and nobody's following you, that you're probably just out there taking a walk. And so what we want leaders to be able to do is figure out how to get more leadership work in the organization, how to get more followers in the organization, and how to get more followers who are inclined to do high performance leadership work. So that's what we're asking people to do. How to make sure that they engage in work that gets people to be high performance followers and to get people to engage in leadership work. If you look around and no one's following you, you're probably not doing leadership and high performance work. You're probably doing some other kind of work, or, as my professor said, just taking a walk. So this idea of leadership and management is the next thing we want to take a look at today. And the question that I would ask you to consider is, does leadership equal management? Are leaders and managers the same thing? Are they in fact interchangeable? Do the skills you have to have as a manager look the same as the skills you have to be a leader within the organization? Does leadership in fact equal management? And so leadership and management is different. And it really is never a competition between the two. And it's never a matter of one being more important than the other. The body of research around leadership simply says, in order to get to better outcomes, you have to find a way to do more leadership and high performance work. And so management work is a bit different. Managers have a shorter range perspective. They've got to get the budget in a timely fashion. They've got to make sure the payroll is done in a fashion. They've got to make sure timesheets are in. That's kind of incremental in terms of the time driven around the activity that has to take place. It's a short range perspective. How do I get through the week? How do I get this in by the end of the month? But a leader has to take a look at a longer range perspective. What should the work look like within the next 5 years? What should the work look like in the next 10 years? How can I plan? How can I thoughtfully engage in a planning process that takes us into the future? That's where leaders focus their effort. Managers plan how and when, and their questions are really about how to get this done and when will you have this done? When will we have this done? Leaders ask a different set of questions. They ask what, and they ask why, and I would also pose for your consideration, they ask who. Because the customer or the person who's coming to you for help and assistance, or the person that you're going to in your work as in your profession, are the most important consideration to keep in mind every day. So the leader will ask what and why and who. The manager eyes the bottom line, while a leader will focus on the horizon. What's out there for us down the road? It's very similar to the long-range perspective. A manager may, in fact, imitate others, and that could be this notion of best practices. So let's find the best practice and use that to get our work done. And that's not necessarily a negative thing. But imitation is not the same as originating. And a leader, because they challenge reality every day, remember the Max Dupree premise, they are able to come up with new ideas. And they don't wait for someone else to come up with the idea that they can imitate or make better. They're able to come up with new ideas. The manager accepts the status quo. This is how things have operated. I'll certainly continue to operate in this fashion. I'm not necessarily committed to creativity or innovation. But a leader is one who challenges the status quo and therefore encourages creativity, innovation in addition to following the rules and regulations. Manager does things correctly, and you've probably seen this before. The leader does the correct thing. And those are not always interchangeable. Sometimes you're required to do things that look like they're the correct thing, but they don't get the outcome, or they're not the best thing to do for the client, customer, or person who's coming in for help or assistance. A leader will do the correct thing on behalf of the people that he or she says they're coming in to work for. Managers seek continuity. Leaders seek change. Managers focus on goals for improvement. Leaders focus on goals of innovation. And so that really connects with this notion of imitating versus originating ideas. You want to originate ideas and focus on goals of innovation and get innovation from wherever you can in the organization. For the managers, their power is based upon their position in the organization or their authority. They are the CEO, they are the executive director, and therefore they derive their power, if you will, their influence over the organization based upon their position. But a leader has power that's based upon their ability to influence people and influence outcomes. And from that perspective, everyone can do leadership work. Even if you're not the CEO or the executive director, if you are able to use the values of the organization to drive the work to get to the best outcomes, from the perspective of working with your peers in teams and in groups within the organization, you can do that without asking for permission from the CEO. This is about personal influence and not position. A manager demonstrates skills in the technical competence areas. So if you're working in HR, you probably know more about HR than anybody else. And so you should be very proficient in HR and personnel and those sorts of things. But a leader demonstrates skill in selling the vision. As a matter of fact, the best leaders are humble enough to realize that people in their positions are probably better at what they need to do than you might be as the CEO. But you still got to focus the organization on the vision and, in point of fact, the value. So here's a tenet that you want to take away with you today. High-performing organizations, the best organizations, have strong values and everybody knows them and can see them demonstrated behaviorally in the organization. And so if you tell me that this is the vision, then how are we moving forward and how can I see that? If you tell me these are the values of the organization, how can I then begin to see them in the behaviors that I witness in the organization? We'll talk a bit more about that before we're done. The manager demonstrates skill in administration. The leader demonstrates skill in dealing with ambiguity. We don't always have clarity. Sometimes circumstances change overnight, and you come into work the next morning and the budget is different, or staff are no longer in place. Someone has resigned or quit or gotten hurt. A circumstance in the broader society has changed. I'm sure that the firefighters who woke up on the West Coast didn't know that they were going to be dealing with something of the scale and scope that we're dealing with now. And so leaders are dealing with ambiguity all the time. That's a bit different than being able to administer. You need administration, but you also need people who can deal with ambiguity in the moment. So there are basically three kinds of work: leadership work, management work, and technical work. Leadership work we spent some time talking about, and can see that on the slide here, as longer term thinking, looking beyond your unit. Don't get caught up in doing silo-driven kinds of work, that you have to reach and influence people who you're working with, and you're constantly putting emphasis on visions and or values, that you know where the organization is going and you know how to get people there. Management work is focusing on getting it done. So the how and the what questions about production and process, and then we have to monitor quality and total quality improvement and continuous quality improvement. Those are management perspectives. They're not leadership work. They are important, but they are different. And then there's the work of getting the actual technical work. And so who is actually going to get the room that we need to have the meeting in? Who's going to make sure you have the supplies and equipment that you need? Who's going to make sure the memo goes out about the meeting so that you can, in fact, have the meeting? These are things that fall into the realm of technical work, and they're important, they're critical, because if you don't have the room, you can't have the meeting. The issue and the challenge for leaders is, how much work am I doing in each of these realms? And am I doing too much in one realm or the other, and therefore keeping myself from doing the kind of leadership work that needs to be done. And so here's an exercise that we might take a look at some point in time and that you might think of doing. You think of a typical week if, in fact, you have a typical week. And I've been in groups where people just laugh when I say this, but if you have a typical week, look at the activities you engaged in during the week: morning, afternoon, evening, night. List those activities and figure out for yourself whether they were in the leadership, management, or technical categories. And we'll look at the chart on the next slide that allows us to do that. And then take a look at something that fell into the management or technical activity area and think of how to turn it into a leadership activity. So that's what the chart would look like. The activities in the large area on your left, and then TML, technical, management, or leadership. And if you come up with check marks that are mostly in the realm of technical and management, the thoughtful leadership considerations: how do I move this into a leadership kind of activity? And so, in fact, if you find out that you're doing a lot of meetings, meetings are a good management activity. They're a great management tool. But unless they focus on the vision and the values of the organization, and until they focus on the people who are coming into the organization for help and assistance and support, the client, the customer, children, youth, families, etc., they're not yet leadership meetings. The way to make sure that they're leadership meetings is to always talk about the customer or the people that you're there for, and always keep the values of the organization in front of you during the course of the meeting. And something just that simple can change a management function into a leadership function. How do I organize responding to email? Looks like more of a task, a technical, and maybe management function. But in the context of that response in your email, if you make sure that there's something there that relates to an outcome that's related to the people that you say you're there for, you've begun to nudge that into the leadership realm. And so that's an exercise that we tend to do to get people to think about where they spend their leadership time. Stephen Covey, the late Stephen Covey, has talked about leadership work that needs to get to higher performance. And he talks about it from the perspective of work being less or more important and urgent and not urgent. And as you can see from this chart, there's 4 quadrants that Covey has done his work in. And he's talked about the work. One is Quadrant 1, which is the crisis or the crises. If it's a crisis, there's no way to get around it. You've got to deal with it. Or if there's a deadline, you've got to make sure you make the deadline, particularly if it's related to funding or something like that, because the organizational viability depends upon that. So you got Quadrant 1 work, unavoidable, very important and urgent. And then there's work that's not as urgent, but it's still important in Quadrant 2, and that's prevention, capacity building, and relationship building. Those are the things that keep us from being overwhelmed by Quadrant 1. And as you can see, high performance is actually in Quadrants 1 and 2. You get through the crisis, you resolve the crisis, and then you immediately begin to figure out how to keep the crisis from overwhelming you and becoming a repetitive reality for you. Quadrant 3 work, less important but maybe urgent, are the phone calls you have to return, the meetings, the pressing matters, reports, mail. You got to find out these things, deal with them, and deal with them in a timely fashion. So they are sometimes not as important, but they can be urgent. Quadrant 4, I call my chill out quadrant. It's trivia, busy work, some phone calls, and I know you know nothing about this bullet, but it's those time wasters. And you've seen people get on their computers and do things that are not necessarily related to work. That's Quadrant 4 work. And so Covey has challenged us by asking, where do we spend our time? You see, once we get done with the crisis, where do we go next? And so if you took a moment and thought about that, just which quadrant do you think your organization would end up in, or a more personal diagnosis, when you get done with the crisis, what do you do next? Covey says we need to go into Quadrant 2. But his research discovered that after we are done with the crisis, we go down to Quadrant 4. Less important, not urgent, and sometimes even time wasters. And why is that? Well, it's because we have to spend time recovering from the crisis. We have to tell people about how wonderful we were during Quadrant 1. And we also just have to kind of make sure we do that throughout the course of the day. So that's Quadrant 4 work. Covey then says we next go to Quadrant 3, and then finally we get back to Quadrant 2, which is where your high performance is. Quadrants 1 and 2 is where we need to be Quadrants 1 and 4 is where we float if we're not careful. So we have to be intentional about getting back to and staying in for longer periods of time, Quadrant 2. So the question we want to ask is, where's your work? Are you in Quadrants 1 and 2, or are you in Quadrants 1 and 4 and don't have time at the end of the day, at the end of the week, at the end of the month to get back to Quadrant 2? So there are approaches to leading and teaching. You can command people and tell them, but you can see the depth of learning will be low. The capacity to develop leaders for the next generation is not as high. The level of commitment is not as high, but the amount of time required is short. Once you tell somebody or command them, you can move on. The highest level of commitment, the greatest capacity for continuous generation of new leaders in the future, and the depth of learning is highest when you teach people. However, it does in fact take more time. And so what I want you to think about is the second tenet that is not necessarily a slide, but it's something I want you to give some consideration to. And that is, leaders must teach. The question may be, what is it that leaders teach? Leaders have to teach about high performance, they have to teach about the values of the organization, and they have to keep the vision of the organization in front of their staff at all times, and they have to demonstrate that in their behaviors. So another exercise we might consider is, think of someone that you follow. Why did you follow them? What did they demonstrate or show you? What did they believe? And what would they not tolerate? What we're talking about here are values and behaviors and the line in the sand and the things that really make leadership come alive. That's the notion of leadership, and that's the place that we're going to spend a bit of time talking about high performance and where we can get to and stay in high performance in the future.